In the brief, you include a list or even several lists of research questions.
I thought that an academic always has to put questions. As a policymaker, I would have just said, this is how it should be.
Welcome back to the FSR Policy Briefcase with me, Leonardo Meeus.
And me, Emma Menegatti.
And we are joined here today by... Wait a minute. Emma, what are you doing here? Where is James?
Don't worry, James hasn't left. He just couldn't make it this time, so I'm stepping in as a replacement.
Okay. Good. So, as I was saying, we are joined here today by Catharina Sikow-Magny, and we are very happy that she joined our school as a part-time professor in September, but you probably already know her. But for those that don't know everything, let me just tell you a few words about Catharina. She is a former director at the European Commission, DG Energy. She was responsible for renewable energy, for markets and for infrastructure. Before that, she was a head of unit, where she was responsible for networks and regional initiatives. And she was also at DG Transport. And before that transport, she was working also with researchers, just like us, like Emma and I. And we, I think, met, if I remember well, around 2010. So you were already in Brussels for a while because you arrived the end of the 90s. So this was actually when the whole liberalization and the whole process started. So you know the Energy Union since the beginning. I came a bit later at 2010. I had the pleasure of working on the infrastructure package, more specifically cost-benefit analysis, and I think that's where we got to know each other. It was always a pleasure to interact with you, and now I'm very happy to also have you as a colleague. So, welcome, Catharina.
Thanks, Leo, and thanks for the nice welcome as well. I'm very happy to be with Florence School of Regulation now.
Let me also set the scene for this episode. So, the motivation of the brief. So, Catharina just joined us and she already produced the brief. Why? Because we had the report that many of you probably already heard about, the report of Mr. Draghi on the competitiveness strategy for Europe. And it includes a lot of recommendations, 400 pages in total even. And a lot of it is on energy. And also on energy infrastructure. And what is interesting is that these 400 pages are also feeding into the discussions and the political guidelines of Ursula von der Leyen, our Commission President. And you see some of it popping up in the Commission letters and probably also in some of the policy action in the coming months. So, Catharina, in her brief, said, very interesting, this report, but the report remains silent on the EU policy framework for energy networks, this well-known Trans-European Networks program for energy. And I didn't know what she meant by that. So I actually had a look in the report, the 400 pages, and it's just a diplomatic way of saying it's not mentioned, funny enough. While this program has been in place since you arrived in Brussels, and it got a big boost in 2013, because it became a regulation, and that regulation was updated in 2022. So it's a bit surprising. 10T is however mentioned, and some aspects of the framework are mentioned indirectly. But we'll come to that in a minute. But this inspired the framework of this podcast, because we thought, okay, that's not the way you wrote it in the brief, but for the podcast we say it's all about Draghi versus 10E, and a bit like in a boxing match, we thought to do 3 rounds. And in every round, I do the opening question, so let's call it the opening punch of today. Catharina will respond, and then we have Emma here, who is more fit than I am, and she will do some follow-up questions, some additional punches. And when she gets tired, we go to the next round. Is that okay? Will we do another ding or a clap, or let's go to the first round. So, Draghi mentions the Connecting Europe facility. Okay, great. He argues that we should have more EU funding for energy networks. Now, we are regulatory experts. We like policy, but we also are regulatory experts at FSR. And I've always been told that grid users are supposed to pay for networks, Catharina, right? Because we've spent a lot of time on discussing how to do that, how to make network tariffs cost reflective. They have to be cost reflective because that's the only way that all the people taking investment decisions or deciding when to consume or produce energy take the cost of the network into account. If they don't, maybe they will overuse the network and we will build out network that we maybe don't need. So Draghi seems to be challenging that idea to have more EU funding. And I wanted to start by asking you, what do you think, Catharina?
I actually agree with both you and Mr. Draghi on what you just said. I mean, if you look at the financing of grids, trans-European networks, we can identify three principles. The first one is what I would call the user-based principle, so the tariffs on users, and this is the most important one. It is the one that should always remain there and be the predominant one. Then for the trans-European networks, we also have what is called beneficiary-based principle, meaning where for an interconnector, for instance, doesn't need to be, but can be also a national project, the benefits and costs are not located in the same place. So benefits may be a completely different place than the costs. And that's where the trans-European networks bring in the cross-border cost allocation or cost sharing, which is another addition to financing a project. It also then, of course, goes to the tariffs, but in a different place where the investment itself necessarily takes place. And then the third one is the taxpayer-based principle, Connecting Europe facility, which is the financing arm of the trans-European networks. So not only for energy, but also for transport and telecoms. And that one is and should be the last resort funding source when the user base and the beneficiary base principles will not leverage the investment. And when could this be the case? I think we are in a situation where we need to accelerate investments. You know, Draghi also points out, Commission has pointed out to the importance of grids in integrating renewables and making the market work. We need to accelerate those investments. This means that tariffs then would increase quite a lot, and we oftentimes already today face an acceptance problem. You know, people don't want to see their tariffs increase a lot. They oftentimes question then the investment. So to accelerate the investments, funding from the EU for European projects can be the way of facilitating first of all building acceptance on the project and making it happen faster than it would otherwise. And linked to this, there is the question of affordability and solidarity. As I mentioned, CEF is the investment or the funding part of the trans-European networks. For energy, it's also the only one that provides funding for cross-border relevant investments. And here we do have situations in Europe where the investments that are needed are very high in certain parts of Europe. You know, take the eastern part of Europe that was not connected to the western part, for instance, that were relying in gas on single source dependent, etc., which is disproportionate for their capability of putting all those costs into the tariffs. So that's why solidarity in the context of affordability when tariffs risk going too high is important. So therefore, for the future, what we see is, first of all, rapidly increasing investment needs. We see also projects where the costs will be higher than the ones we've seen in the past, in addition to the speeding up. I'm referring here to, for instance, the offshore developments, especially in the non-shallow sea waters that we have also in Europe. Then, okay, whatever will happen on the hydrogen side, that may also be something where public support, European support for cross-border relevant projects could be relevant. But what we need to keep in mind, and that is what the Commission, when starting preparing the next multi-annual financial framework, is to be sure that we keep the incentives right, that we don't create a funding program that will incentivize everybody to come there first and then delay investments. So there should always be first tariffs, be they domestic or cross-border cost allocation, and there should be externalities so not just any project that looks nice. Externalities meaning, I don't know, secure supply, maybe innovation that has higher risks than other projects, and then the solidarity that I already mentioned. But CEF, yes, should be bigger, much bigger, but we should keep the rules in place to ensure that public money will always be the last resort funding source.
If I can add to that, one more argument I heard, and I don't know if you like that argument, is to say the more we do anticipatory investments, because we're worried if we wait too long before we know exactly what we need, then we will be too late. And if you do anticipatory investments, then you could say tariffs are not cost reflective anymore, because you're doing costs for future users, but you're putting all the costs on the current users. So then maybe the future users you want to attract don't even come. For instance, if you would electrify a system and you double the tariff, then the people considering to electrify maybe don't want to come anymore. So that's an additional argument sometimes, I think.
Yep, absolutely, and it links to the speed, so that we need to, with the grid, anticipate what renewables or what other sources may come. And of course, there is always uncertainty whether they come or not. So that could be also an additional justification, indeed.
Up to you, Emma.
Yes, and I'm really happy to be here and listen to such a fascinating topic. But now I'm wondering how feasible it is to increase these EU funds, because you're saying they're so important. So maybe you could give us a bit more insights into the history of this Connecting Europe facility and how realistic it is to ask for more funding through this facility.
There was already, well before the CEF was put in place, something what was called the 10 budget, Trans-European Network budget. It had relatively big money for transport, but for energy it was 155 million for 7 years. So it was mainly used to provide a little bit of support for some studies, not for investments, obviously. It was 20 million per year, so was not enough. And in those days, there was strong opposition to bring public money to energy because of the reasons that we just discussed on tariffs should be the ones to finance all the investments. But then 2009 there was another recession and economic crisis, and the Commission put together a small program of recovery program. For energy, overall for the energy grids, there was 2 billion, which was then, huge. Was still a lot of opposition. Regulators were all against of putting public money. But that's when a lot of gas reverse flow projects, some electricity interconnectors were financed through that. And based on that, Commission then realized that to speed up these investments and also to bring sometimes member states together, because they may have diverging interests from an interconnector. So facilitate their consensus building, public money would be needed. And that's when CEF then got created. The first CEF had between 5 and 6 billion for 7-year period. The second one, more or less, the current one, more or less a similar amount. And then Commission will prepare now for the third one. There is a lot of preparation ongoing, and we will see what will come out. Certainly, times are not easy for increasing EU budget, but at the same time, I think there is acknowledgement and understanding that grids, they are trans-European by nature, and they will, in the end, bring benefits to consumers in terms of lower cost of the whole system. So, with that, a little bit more budget would bring benefits that more than outweigh the budget. But it will certainly be a very interesting political discussion and to see how it will go.
Okay, thank you. Very clear. So let's see whether it increases or not. So you also discuss the fact that the distribution level might need to be included in the picture. And that there is an untapped potential to use cohesion funds for distribution networks as well. Can you tell us a bit more about these cohesion funds, and is that significant, and what are they currently used for if it is not for distribution grids?
Cohesion policy in general is a shared responsibility between member states and the Commission. So member states prepare their plans on what they need to do and then discuss these with the Commission to make sure that they focus on the EU policy objectives. In the current cohesion policy, there is a priority called local grids and storage, for which initially something like 6 billion was forecasted to be used. Some member states have used it, others have not, and it always depends on very much on member states' priorities and how what they see as the most important sectors to be financed via the EU budget. What is, however, to be kept in mind when we speak about cohesion policy is that it aims at supporting the member states that are lagging behind. So the ones that whose GDP per capita is below the average of the EU, so they get more of this funding than the other member states. So it also depends there if you get very little, maybe then you put it somewhere else than in the local grids. But investment needs in distribution level are already today higher than they are on the transmission, on the trans-European level. And we also see bottlenecks emerging which risk delaying investments then in local renewables, uptake of electric vehicles, etc., etc. So there is an urgent need to tackle this, and again, the preparation of the next multi-annual budget by the Commission could be a way of making sure that distribution level investments are adequately addressed.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting.
Are you happy with the first round?
Yes.
You can go? Okay.
Very happy.
Ding! Draghi versus Teny, round 2. So Mr. Draghi also argues in his report that we need more cooperation among member states. And you, in your brief, seem to agree with that, because you refer to the fact that we had these national energy climate plans, we had resilient plans, which were again national. So maybe it's true that we've put a bit too much emphasis on national recently. But you remind us in your brief that TEN-E, this networks policy basically and regulation, has a strong regional component. You referred to the high-level groups, and I got to know one recently from the North Seas. But maybe you can tell our audience a little bit more about these high-level groups, who you think can play a bigger role. What are they? How do they work? And
of course, as you said, national energy and climate plans and the recovery plans, they are national in nature, and they will not naturally bring trans-European investments, cross-border investments to the place. There, I don't see the need for more cooperation between member states at the national level, because we already have the trans-European network framework. So, and that is, as the name says, it's already top-down trans-European, not bottom-up member state initiated project. So the trans-European networks, when it was first adopted, the regulation as we know it, in 2013 it entered into force, it already had a very different energy picture to address. So we had the famous 2020 targets by 2020 on greenhouse gases, renewables and energy efficiency. The third internal energy market package had been adopted. That also created the European regulator ACER, created the European networks for transmission system operators for electricity and gas, and also created the 10-year network development plan. 10-year network development plan, as the name says, covers the whole EU and a bit more, and aims at looking things from the European perspective. What the Trans-European Networks regulation then did, it complemented these by making sure, on the one hand, that the 10-year network development plan is accompanied by the cost-benefit analysis, and that's where your contribution was taken up. It focused also on making sure that scenarios used in electricity and gas were converging, because at that time they were completely different. And then it focused on selecting projects of common interest, that many people know by the acronym PCI. Also, again, based on technical assessment, cost-benefit analysis. But perhaps the most important here was the working method, and that's the regional cooperation. Regional cooperation, dividing Europe in 4 regions, for be it electricity or be it gas, at the time, where all stakeholders come together, and stakeholders meaning transmission system operators or project promoters, regulators, member state representatives, industry, civil society, and then of course the European organizations like ACER, ENTSO and Commission. And already for the 10E, for the selection of the project of common interest, these regional groups assess where are the needs, so what are the bottlenecks, with the aim of getting consensus built. Then they do with the support of the network operators, the cost-benefit analysis assessment, so they look at that. And in the end, I think the most important of the regional cooperation is to build common understanding on what are the problems and what kind of projects can solve those. So ideally, there would be full understanding that the PCIs are the right ones. Doesn't always happen, but still, with time, little by little. So this is the 10E framework. On top of that, the Commission established high-level groups, and they are more or less the same. So there is one in the Baltic region, then one in Central Southeastern Europe, Southwestern Europe, and then around the Northern Seas. And they were built or put in place in order to have the necessary political push when need be. So sometimes one needs the top level, be it the ministers of energy, or in some cases the heads of state and government, to push certain projects that are difficult for one and necessary for the other one. They are also sometimes called to take decisions on what are really the regional priorities, the most important projects, and then steer the process overall. So that's why the high-level groups were created, and they have been very instrumental, very necessary to make sure that the technical level works as intended to work. And what we can see as results very rapidly, for instance, for the Baltic region, just one per region, so we will see the 3 Baltic states, their electricity grid synchronized with the continental European grid, and get them desynchronized from Russian and Belarusian grid. This is a 10-year process. Investments have been more than 2 billion, and very much thanks to the regional cooperation. Central Southeastern Europe, CESEC for short, there the achievement was that when, remember in 2009, when Russia cut supply in gas to the region, people were freezing in the cold of January and there was simply no gas. There was a lot of gas in west, but we couldn't transport it to the east. So all the investments were then discussed in the regional setting. What do we need? Which reverse flows? What diversification sources? And today, when Russia again cut gas for various countries in 2022, nobody was freezing. I mean, gas prices were high, yes, but there was gas. So again, thanks to the regional cooperation. Southwest has seen, connecting the Iberian Peninsula through France to the rest of the EU, has seen also the construction start on the Biscay Bay project, so doubling the interconnectivity between the peninsula and France. And then the Northern Seas, that you are also very familiar with, that has been working already for a decade. And I think we will see very soon the first artificial islands, the first hybrid projects in that region, and again based on regional cooperation. Regional cooperation is not an aim in itself, but it is like a stepping stone towards European approach, where one concentrates on really the specificities of each of the regions. So it should also remain a flexible tool and be adjusted according to the needs.
Thank you. And you mentioned the idea of a European coordinator for these high-level groups. Can you please explain a bit the difference with European coordinators and how such a coordinator could reinforce the high-level groups? What about having a secretariat, an office, a facility, or even an entity, which has also been suggested in the North Seas?
Well, all those would be good, but they have a big difference in terms of cost, I would say. I mean, when I suggested in the paper that maybe a European coordinator could be appointed for each of the high-level groups, the idea is not new. I mean, the possibility to appoint a coordinator is already in the TENI regulation since 2013. In 2009, there were 4 coordinators in Europe. And on the transport side, they have, I think, a dozen coordinators for major corridors that cross Europe from north, south, east, west, and vice versa. And in the energy, then the 4 coordinators completed their mission, and then we didn't have more coordinators until now. Again, the idea is emerging again. And I think the coordinator, the role would be to be a facilitator. I mean, in support, Commission sometimes takes this role, but Commission is also scarce in resources and has a lot of work to do. So it could be in support not only of the Commission, but of all the participants, so the member states concerned. And anyway, by the TENI regulation, the coordinator needs to be appointed in agreement with the member states. So that would provide like a neutral facilitator, would provide additional resources. It's a part-time position. It's not actually paid. So that's why I mentioned that there are differences in costs when it comes to that. So it's an honorary position in a way. But what we have seen in transport, and then some of the early coordinators in the energy side, they did bring people together and they did manage to find solutions for difficult things. And I just mentioned one of them. It's Mario Monti, who was working on Spain-France interconnector on the Mediterranean side. And through his work, there was a solution found how to build it and how to finance it. So that's why the idea could be it's a rapid way of getting more resources. But of course, the other ideas that you mentioned, secretariat or facility, are also interesting. They will cost more money. No secretariat will work without a salary. So one has to assess what are the needs, what willingness there is, where the funding could come from, and all that. But in the meantime, the coordinator could already start.
Okay, thank you. No, I really like the idea. And I think this closes the second round, unless you have another.
No, I'm okay. Let's go for the third round. So Draghi versus TENI. Permitting, not an easy topic as well. The Draghi report talks about the 28th regime for permitting, but also here, the TENI regulation that we've been talking about with these projects of common interest or PCIs already have some sort of regime for permitting, right? There is the one-stop shop idea, there is also deadlines set at EU level. You mentioned that maybe we can go even further, right? If we really want to implement the Draghi idea, it could even be including an EU permitting agency or something like that. But before discussing this type of ideas, maybe it's nice that you share with us the experience with implementation of the current framework. How successful has it been? How much has changed already thanks to this regulation?
Yeah. So in 2013, when the TENI regulation was amended, the idea of looking at permitting already emerged. And maybe just as an anecdote, I remember when it was raised first time with member states, our Commissioner Oettinger at the time was very keen on getting this. And when we met with the member states, the only word we heard from all of them was, no, this is subsidiarity, don't touch it. Well, we did make a proposal and it went through. And at the end, there were ministers, I always remember one of the council meetings where they were saying that, but this is not subsidiarity because these are cross-border projects. So it matured during the discussion. And what it brings then is, as you said, the one-stop shop. There is one-stop shop per member state for the project of common interest. Member states may use it for other projects as well if they wish. binding timelines. So the statutory period when the file has been submitted to the authority is maximum 1.5 years for the permit. Of course, refusing the permit is always possible if the project is not good enough from environmental point of view. And then there are a few other things, also coordination between the authorities across borders, providing priority status for the projects, and also acceleration if that exists already in a member state. So in a way, the rules are there, the one-stop shop is there, and yet we see delays in implementation. And I think that is something, well, somebody should definitely look into what are the causes. There may be many. I mean, it could also be that there are not enough staff in the permitting authorities. But what I've also heard is that maybe the provisions are not applied as rigorously as they should, because they also say that the permitting authority shall not ask questions during the statutory period unless force majeure, but all questions should have already been told to the promoter before submitting the file. So I think that's an interesting question. Why are there still delays? And that's something that I would suggest to look into. But on that, what Draghi proposed then, the 2028 regime, well, I also proposed, and he proposed that maybe a European coordinator for permitting could be established, really to look into why is this happening, facilitating, helping member states implement, etc. But on the 28th regime, so a European permitting authority, I think it's a very attractive idea. We were considering it when making the first proposal, but that was at that time deemed really far too ambitious. I think the question now is, I think it's very attractive to be looked at, but one should first sound with member states, is there any appetite? Because it is putting decision-making power at a different level. If there is no appetite, I would wait because resources are scarce and I would then focus on implementation. If there is appetite, maybe regionally, maybe the Northern Seas for instance, then maybe one could go that way and would certainly be useful. So maybe the offshore could offer the potential as a starting point and then to see where it goes. But I would not push for it against strong negative views of member states if this were the case.
Okay, very interesting.
Yeah, and for the last question, it will be a bit more open because in the brief you include a list or even several lists of research questions which you identified. Can we see this as a research agenda? Can you maybe highlight a few of these questions and why you would like to work on them in the future?
Thanks. I thought that an academic always has to put questions. You know, as a policymaker, I would have just said, this is how it should be. No, jokes apart. I mean, when assessing Draghi's work and then assessing on whether, you know, I agree or not with his recommendations, I already had a lot of questions in the sense that, you know, if one would want to go this way, it's not as simple, you know, one would need to think about. And if we take as example the permitting, for instance, where I already mentioned that before going in his direction, I would first want to have the information on the one hand on why are there delays. So are the delays really because of lacking 28th regime or something else? And then whether there is willingness from member states. So this is maybe as such not a research agenda for this question, but more like an information collection. But in other areas, I think it could build into like a research agenda. And here maybe one question could be, if we look, taking us back to the question of financing, so we have the user-pays principle, beneficiary-pays principle through cross-border cost allocation, taxpayer principles through CEF, but then we also have congestion rents that are accumulating. We have the inter-TSO compensation mechanism. Then if we look at production for renewables and nuclear through the market design now, There is for publicly supported contract for difference, privately investments, PPAs, capacity mechanisms if there is not enough adequacy in member states. Some people have now raised the need to go for locational price signals. And all the questions then, how would this go together with government organized auctions? So I think there is a lot of potential financial sources, be it then for grids or for production as some of these. So I think it could be good time to start looking at, do these fit together? Are these fit for purpose? We have relied until now on energy-only market, whereby the price signal triggers the necessary investments then in production, in capacities. But we see that the energy market is not working, apart maybe some exceptions in Europe, because of the support to renewables. If somebody goes for renewables, for nuclear, I'm sure it also requires support from public sector. Capacity mechanisms is a way of supporting as well. So how will our energy system, broadly speaking, look like in the future? And will our current financing sources or the instruments be the right ones? Will they be enough? I mean, I don't know. The answer may be that it's perfect, but that's, I think, the beauty of research. You have a question and then you start exploring, and then you oftentimes get interesting surprises as a result.
Great. Are you okay, Emma, closing this round?
Yes,
Okay.
perfect. Thank you. I'm intrigued and really looking forward to having some elements of answer for all these questions.
Okay. So I think we can close the podcast by just thanking you again, Catharina, not only for the podcast, but for the brief and for joining us. And we look forward to you implementing some of that research agenda. The agenda is already huge, so you will have to stay for a while, several years, and probably we will see you back as well on the podcast, to discuss some of these more specific questions. Then the big surprise will it be Emma? Will it be James? I think I heard him in the back. I think he's back. He didn't leave us for the moment. So thank you all. Thank you, Catharina.
Thank you both.
Emma.
Many thanks. Many thanks. My pleasure.